distracted at times. I woke up this morning and can't hear out of this ear, and so I am finding it quite hard at times, and it may limit our ability to have a proper discussion at the end. However, it's not stopping me from talking. I wanted to begin by just introducing a little bit my own background, because as we've just heard, the place that we're coming from says a lot about our current ontology, or our way of seeing the world. And my own background was as a regular teacher of English, but after I had been teaching for about 6 or 7 years, I had come up with a number of questions about learning that I couldn't find answers to from my colleagues. We were very much categorising some students, about a third, as students who don't do well. And I was wanting to know how we teach these students, and why, for example, when I taught a class paragraphs last year, this year they have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about paragraphs. And I was fortunate enough to get a 1-year scholarship to study special education, and I was fortunate enough that at that time the course was heavily research focused, very much focused on empirical use of data, and I was also able to start doing a Master of Education. And those two forces brought about what we've just heard about in terms of a threshold concept shift. I had to move from a categorising view of education, where I assigned labels to students and then expected things accordingly, to a view of education where I, as the teacher in charge of instruction, was the one who was able to make the difference to how that student was taught, and therefore how they responded, and therefore how they learned. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of those key concepts that have shifted my thresholds, if you like. And I hope that they're useful for you. My deepest fear is that they're all old hat to you and no use. I'm not promising anything magical or new. I'm sure that you're going to go, but that's just common sense. My own experience is that common sense is often missing from education. So, first thing I want to say is that I was puzzled when I started doing my training, because we spent a lot of time on assessment. And assessment to the nth degree. So, not just doing a standardised test, but then saying, okay, so we now know which students are scoring at the lower end. What can you tell me about what they can do? Pretty much nothing. All I know is how they rank. So, instead of saying, Simon needs to improve the accuracy of his sentences, which is what I can normally get away with when I'm writing a school report, if I actually want to teach Simon and his classmates, I need to be able to know, can Simon identify the subject of a sentence? Can I identify the subject of a sentence? Can he identify the predicate? Can he identify the verb? Can he generate one of those? Can he combine them? Can he extend them and elaborate them? And so, by taking it down to a much smaller step, suddenly we get to that zone where, as we just heard, the teacher's role is to give our students small victories. And what I was doing was saying to students, so last week we did paragraphs and now we're doing essays. But I had students who were struggling to make the subject and the verb agree. And I was skipping that because I had taught them so they should know. But it doesn't work like that, does it? So the first thing I want to say about working with low attainers is that we have to be prepared to spend a lot more time on close assessment to a very fine level, and secondly, that we shouldn't expect rapid progress in large steps, but we should look for steady progress in small steps. And when a lot of those small steps have been mastered and come together, we will then find that they are able to accommodate more complex or larger concepts, and they'll begin to put them together well. And as a key rule of thumb that has been very helpful for me and the students I've taught, if a student is not doing something, or doesn't appear to be able to do something, slice back, go back to the component skills, and break it down even further. We don't have time to go into a whole session on how to break those skills down. But for example, when I'm teaching sentences, I'll give you some examples later, I will have a whole range of these indicators that I'm looking for, and I will set very simple tasks as part of a classroom lesson that will tell me whether a student can identify the subject or not. Almost invariably they can't, often because they haven't been, usually because they haven't been taught. And that's not a criticism of teachers, it's just that it's something that they do need to know in order to master sentences. And I have found that if students can identify verbs in all their forms and subjects accurately, they can then begin to master sentences much better. So I want to move on now to some key components that affect both reading and writing. Students who are low attainers almost invariably, not always, but almost invariably, have a limited vocabulary. And they need two main kinds of vocabulary I'm sure you're familiar with. They need an expressive vocabulary where they can name a range of emotions, feelings, attitudes and thoughts. And they often don't. So for example, instead of talking about feeling apprehensive, they will say that something was scary. And so you say, find another word. And they say, frightened. You say, find another word. They say, terrified. And that's it. They don't know any other words, and there's no subtlety or gradation in the range of meanings. If we can communicate to them that subtlety or gradation, we are introducing them into one of those small victories that can also lead to a threshold concept shift in terms of the way that they're using language, and in fact the way that they see themselves. We can also give them, I would suggest it's a more challenging target, but it can be done, an academic vocabulary. And certainly by GCSE, students must have, in all their subjects, but particularly I would argue English, an academic vocabulary which extends well beyond the keywords for their subject. You know, we go into a classroom and there are keywords on the wall. See, those are my keywords. I've done literacy. Yeah? But actually it doesn't work like that. What students need is a whole range of words that are appropriate to use, not just keywords or terms or jargon for a subject, but a whole range of expressions that enable them to link and join those subjects and critique them. So the question, of course, is how to do that. It's all very well someone saying, well, that's what we should do. I think we all agree that we should do those things. I would suggest that as well as introducing them to words, that we teach vocabulary through morphology. And we heard from our head teacher this morning how they're using spelling with morphographs here as a way of helping students to come to terms with the fact that words are actually made of units of meaning. So we have affixes like ing and ed and s on verbs. We have prefixes and suffixes, but we also have word endings that show us that things are particular types of words. For instance, ation, ation, is usually on the end of a word that applies to a process that takes place. We'll look at an example in a moment. By teaching students the parts of words and getting them to recognise that those parts of words have meanings, we have a multiplying effect. Once they recognise that a prefix implies a certain meaning, like an opposite meaning, and we have lots, don't we, like dis, in, d, then students know that it's the reverse of something. And then they're looking at the rest of the word to see what's being reversed. By doing that, we're increasing their independence, their ability to attack words, dismantle them for meaning. And we're also giving them access to assessment criteria, because as they build up that vocabulary, they are now beginning to actually be able to address the technical vocabulary that's required at GCSE and, as we know, increasingly assessment academic subjects. A couple of examples. The word omniscient. We can teach them how the prefix omni means to do with all global, omnibus, omnibus, omnipotent, and how that word, it just looks like a bit of a word, doesn't it? See it? But it's related to the word science, and that's related to the word conscience. It's about what we know. So when we see that, prescient is about knowing things before they happen. Yeah? And so they begin to make links then between these words because they can recognise parts. A simple word like dehydration has three morphological parts. So there's the hydro part for water, there's the ation part which indicates that a process is taking place, and there's the D part which means we're taking away from it. And in doing so, I'm teaching them D, but I say, so there are other words like demerit or devalue or devolve. And so I'm now introducing them to a range of other words that use that same pattern. So you see we're multiplying the number of words that they encounter in order to understand this one word. I'm not suggesting that they will remember all of those words. What I am suggesting is that they'll begin to see the pattern. My job as a teacher is to make sure that they re-encounter words or these patterns in succeeding lessons. Because I haven't got the citation in my head, I'm sorry, but the recommendation is that students normally need to encounter a word about 10 times in order to begin to integrate it into their own vocabulary. So teaching it once doesn't work. Teaching it twice doesn't work. I need to keep using it, and I need to use it independently. There's a reminder there too about Professor Graham Nuttall. He did Hidden Lives of Learners and a few other great pieces of work. I got to work with him back in New Zealand actually. One of the things that he talked to us about was how they discovered after a year's working with students that if you encounter a concept 3 or 4 times in 24 hours, you'll remember it a year later. So what I need to do is make sure that today's lesson, beginning of the lesson and the end of the lesson, something in their homework, and something at the beginning of next lesson touches on anything key that I want them to remember. And by following that simple process, I've found that many of my students, I wouldn't say all, but many of my students, do remember key words and ideas better, simply because they happen more often. A couple of references for you on vocabulary, because I'm aware that we've got a few other things to cover. This piece here, by Alison Boardman and a few other people in the States, is an excellent meta-analysis of what appears to be effective practice for adolescent struggling readers. I should add that these, you'll find links to pretty much all the things that I'm talking about on the Thinking Reading website. If you don't know, I'm part of Thinking Reading with Diane. And, but the Boardman one is very readable, I think, and covers a wide range of things that adolescent readers need help with. Kerry Hempenstall from Melbourne writes on the NIFTY, that's the National Institute for Direct Instruction website in the United States, but he's actually in Australia. And Kerry writes really long, detailed summaries of research on different topics. And if I could only choose one person whose papers I would have, it's his, because he has everybody else's stuff in his papers. His summaries are incredible. They're very detailed, they're very thorough, and he'll just go on and on and on. And so it's just fantastic to have on file to refer to when you need to. This is an older one, but I haven't seen anything since that changes the things that Nagy is saying. He was a bit of an expert on vocab. He was still around in the 2000s, I think, but I'm not sure if he's still working now. But Bill Nagy has some really interesting stuff on reading comprehension and vocabulary. So that's another one to just keep an eye out for. Okay. We know that, I'm not going to talk about decoding much today. I will be talking about spelling, so we'll deal with it there. Diane's session on Thinking Reading this afternoon will be doing a lot about decoding, so I don't need to, thank goodness. We know that there is a big need for comprehension. We often have students in our classes who are reading they're reading reasonably accurately, but not very fast, but they really don't seem to be able to get enough out of the text. In fact, often they aren't even extracting the most explicit information. Or they will extract the surface information, but they're not linking ideas, and they're certainly not making inferences. The comments I'm going to be making after this are mostly linked to Siegfried Engelmann's Corrective Reading Comprehension. It's a program which is available from McGraw-Hill. It's one of the direct instruction suite, along with more spelling with morphographs that was mentioned earlier. Comprehension, I think, is different depending on the kind of students you have. More able readers can intuit things. You know, they just kind of picked up along the way to make these inferences, or even to make these analyses. Whereas for low attainers, they often need quite explicit practice. There's a balance to this practice thing that we'll come to. But when I've worked with teachers in the past, we have all tended to have a consensus, and it's very different for some of you young bright things, but most of us said that actually we're given lots of resources which test comprehension, i.e. they have comprehension questions, so we did comprehension, yeah? But how do we teach it? How do I help a student who's not comprehending and help them to do it? The first point about that is that if they aren't fluent readers, if they are accurate but slow, that is going to hold back their comprehension immensely. Because if it takes you a long time to work out, to get to the end of the sentence, you can't remember the beginning. Yeah? And even all of us will be good readers, but you will know in academic study, if you're reading a text that's very dense with long sentences, you will get to the end of the sentence and not remember it. So you just have to imagine that for your students, 10 words may be a long sentence, and it's the same experience. One of the first points that needs to be made about reading comprehension is actually that auditory memory may be a significant component of this. I'm not saying that people with poor comprehension who can't remember what they hear. I'm saying they need to learn to remember more of what they hear, and we need to teach them. Engelmann says that listening comprehension is linked to auditory memory. The reason that people don't know what you said, or don't understand what you told them, is because they can't remember, by and large. They're not used to processing large chunks of heard language. And so, in corrective reading comprehension, for example, Engelmann has a lot of call and response and asking students to repeat back sentences which gradually get longer. And a lot of people look at it and go, well, that's American, and it's drill, and you're just getting the kids to parrot you. No, we're getting the students to remember what they've heard and say it back. And they get lots of practice at doing that because it extends their ability to process language and to hold it in their head while they process it. The second thing that I want to say about reading comprehension is that inference is essential. And I want to touch on 3 loose ways of looking at inference. The first is logical inference. So the statement's made, I got up at 7 o'clock. There's one statement there that we can make a logical inference, can't we? What was I doing before 7 o'clock? I was in bed, wasn't I? I got up, I must have been in bed. So some things that we say can have logical inferences. Okay? So there's a logical inference of I eat all the bread, how much is left? No, logical inference. Yeah? Now some students take a while to realise that you can make a firm logical inference from things. You could even call that a logical conclusion. And so because that's a bit of work for them, the idea of a probable inference, which is the area that we work with a lot in English, isn't it? We want students to score at higher levels. They need to make inferences about the text they're reading. I ate 6 sandwiches when I got home. What's the probable inference? probable inference. There could be other inferences we could make. I'm greedy. The sandwiches were really, really nice, and I just couldn't help eating the next one. Well, they were very small sandwiches. Yes, that's it. Which brings us on to the next kind of inference, and that's possible inferences, where the writer leaves a lot of room for us to make conjecture. And this is particularly so earlier on in novels and stories, where they want to create a sense of mystery and they want to engage our imagination. So, the man stood at the door for some time before knocking. That leaves us open to all kinds of possibilities, doesn't it? Was he hesitant? Was he deciding whether to knock or not? Was he listening? Was he waiting for something? Had he arrived early and he didn't want to come in late? And those kinds of conversations, once students start realising that they're allowed to make conjectures, and those possible inferences are very helpful to them in beginning to understand that there is a sense in which they can own the text that they're reading, and that all the meanings aren't predefined, and as we heard this morning, not everything is certain. So I would recommend teaching these three kinds of inference, and simply by using those kinds of statements. You can, of course, teach this by putting two statements together from the text and saying, so what's the connection? And that's, but I haven't gone to that because I figure that most people do that all the time anyway. And then there's this really interesting one about the main idea. Teaching the main idea, I found particularly frustrating, because to me it was really obvious what the main idea of the paragraph was. And my main strategy was find the topic sentence. What's the topic sentence? It's the one that tells you what the main idea is. Yeah? So how do we help students to actually identify the main idea? This interesting man here, Bob Dixon, put a program together called Reading Success. It's also on the direct instruction suite. And it's a fascinating structure. It's not the only strategy he teaches in the program. But what he says is, we use this idea of anaphora. So I'm sitting there in the seminar in the States and thinking, what's anaphora? Anaphora is all the references in a paragraph or in a text to the same thing. So let's have a look at this. So if we find all the references to the knights of medieval England, okay, so just take a moment to read that. So how many would we say are there?
I'd say 5.
6. Yeah, so there's quite a few there. Now, if I ask students to go through there, at first I find this difficult. Okay, so you might get them to take a highlighter or just underline, and they will pick up 2 or 3. And one of the first things they need to do is to recognise, and I've found this really simple and practical. I want you to identify all the pronouns. So the students, okay, pronouns. So you remind them what pronouns are. And they go through, and you say, okay, so who does they refer to? And it's amazing how often they go, oh, I don't know. Okay? Getting them to make sure that they know who that pronoun refers to is a really helpful thing in terms of their comprehension. But they then begin to connect a paragraph that to them was quite disjointed. And the fact was, the student was reading this paragraph without knowing that they referred back to the Knights of Medieval England. So the next sentence was useless to them, or him. So, anaphora can include more than pronouns, but the priority is making sure that students recognise pronouns and know who those pronouns are referring to. Okay. What time does the session finish again?
11:55.
11:55, thank you. Okay, so this one I hopefully we won't need to spend much time on. Many of you will be familiar with Daniel Willingham, and what Willingham says about comprehension is reading comprehension strategies, like the ones I've taught you, can be taught and practiced in about 10 sessions. After that, the students, if they've mastered them, you don't need to keep teaching it for 50. But what you do need to do is make sure that you do spend time on making sure that they get good background knowledge. So I'm thinking reading, for example, Diane has used lots of texts that give students lots of background knowledge on different topics, not just nice stories about flowers and bats. And Willingham cites examples where, for example, on the subject of baseball, poor readers who knew a lot about baseball did much better than good readers who didn't. In other words, your knowledge of the topic greatly influences how much you understand. I found that when I went to university, and no doubt you did too. For the first 6 weeks, I was getting my head around the jargon and trying to read through textbooks on sociology. And after 6 weeks, I realised, it's not that I don't really understand, it's just that I need to get my head around the terms, this background knowledge for sociology. Once I know that, then it's okay. And it was after that that I realised that sociologists didn't know anything. But I'm going to stop and tell you a joke. There's a sociologist, a scientist, and a mathematician on a train to Scotland. You know this one? And they look out the window and they see a sheep, and the sheep is black. And the sociologist says, sheep in Scotland are black. And the scientist says, no, all we can say is that one sheep in Scotland is black. And the mathematician, Andrew Old, says, all we know is that half of one sheep in Scotland is black. So there's a reference to Willingham and Lovat there, but of course Willingham has a blog and plenty on the internet, so if you're not familiar with Dan Willingham, he's really hot on reading comprehension, very helpful, and of course a nice balance in terms of saying, just because something works, as we heard before, don't try and make that do everything. Background knowledge is important, inference is important, vocab is important. And I've put the board one there, which you've already had, and that there is a reference to Kahneman and Engelmann's theory of instruction. I confess I haven't finished it yet, but I love reading it. And I do tend to dip in and out of reference books. It is well worth persevering with. It is, in terms of threshold concepts, it is way beyond where most educators are at the moment. My own view is that it will be some years before the education profession picks up on the fact that back in the 60s and 70s, Engelmann was on something. I now want to just talk a little bit about writing in sentences, because we've still got a few minutes left. And a key part of direct instruction is to actually analyse the content of what you're teaching and think about what's required. There is a presentation element, how I present that content, and there is a student response element, what I get them to do, and the stages in which I get them to do it, the order, and then the speed and the number of times they do it before they put it together. And so, one of the key things when we're thinking about expressive writing is, do students understand the key things that are required in order to make a sentence? Because if they don't, they're going to have trouble. How do you discriminate whether it's a sentence or not? I have to confess, I was never taught at school what constitutes a grammatical sentence and what doesn't. It was the 70s, and I got that for teachers. Parts of speech don't define a sentence. I'm not saying they're not useful, but talking about nouns and verbs and stuff doesn't help, because grammatically we need to talk about things like the verb and the subject. So let's look at verbs. You can quickly spot the verbs there, can't you? why would I show that range of sentences to students? So we've got simple past, we've got a phrasal verb, made up of more than one word. Woke is different from woke up. I've got an example of the verb to be. I've got future using I am going to. We've got simple present, and I've got a couple of infinitives. So students need to be introduced to a range of verb types over time in order to spot them. Verbs are not doing words. Please don't say that. Because I say this every year to students, tell me what a verb it's a doing word. Well, that's after a describing word and a thing. So I'll give students a task like that just to find out if they can see the verb. But what I teach them is, I teach them a couple of direct instruction rules that simply, clearly and unambiguously, I think, explain what a verb is and what a sentence is. So this is what I teach them. A verb is a word that tells us that someone is doing, being, or thinking. Because if you tell them it's a doing word and the person's not doing something, they get confused. See? So, Tashona wondered what time detention would finish. What was Tashona doing? Well, she was sitting in detention. So, instead I say, what word tells us what Tashona was doing, being, or thinking? Wonder. Good. So that's the verb. Whereas a sentence we can teach like this. It must have a verb and a subject and make sense on its own. And that rule will fit all sentences in English. Let's look at a couple of examples. Do you need, does anyone need that? I will endeavour to put these up for you to download if you think they're in use. So I will then ask students in a DI sequence whether this is a sentence or not. So when I click like that, I want you to say sentence or not a sentence. Everybody say sentence? Yes. And everybody say not a sentence? No. Okay. A frog sat on a lily pad. Sentence or not? I'm going to tell you about sentence or not? No. Katie, can you tell me why it's not a sentence?
Because it doesn't have an object or a thing that it's
Good.
really about. It doesn't make sense of its own.
Very good. Okay. Does it have a verb? Yes. And going to. Does it have a subject? I. Does it make sense on its own? No. 3 things they need to check. You can give them that rule and then ask them to check their work. So when they're green penning off there, they can also actually do something useful. Okay, so I will give them lots of practice on that. They need lots. And one of the things that I learned when I went to study is practice involves lots and lots of practice, and that means lots and lots of materials. Which is why the DI programs are actually worth buying in, because they have the materials made for you, and you don't have to spend hours doing it. It's actually cost effective. The fact that it's American, okay, sorry about the bomb, but it's still, useful. Okay, lastly, spelling. Students struggle with spelling for a number of reasons, and mostly those are related to the fact that they haven't been taught the phonetic code of the language. And so when we come back to morphology, as we talked before, understanding that words are made up of parts, and they just need to decode parts of words and then put those together, is very helpful. It also means that when we're teaching reading, or when they're reading, that is still at work, because the code is it's a key principle that reading is decoding, spelling is encoding. And so if we're teaching them both as employing a phonetic code, or phonological code, then students will get the double benefit. if we focus on meaning in reading without focusing on how we derive that meaning from the units of language, students will miss key steps and will neither extract meaning nor, in fact, words. So memorising whole words is an ineffectual strategy. It's better to teach them in syllables and preferably in morphemes if you can. So we teach spelling patterns, and so we can explicitly teach a group of words. So yesterday I was teaching a group of students who are fairly new language learners. Most of them arrived from Syria in the last year or so. And so I was teaching them about word endings, and I used the ATION, and we looked at vision and decision and precision, and we did all those together as a group, so they could see that when you've got that combination of letters, the S, one of my Syrian boys pointed out, he said, so when the S is followed by ION, it comes out as a J. And it's like, yes. I'll sit back, you teach the class. That means it's essential for us to know the code as well as the students. And actually, being honest, most teachers have a limited grasp of the code. Our knowledge has been intuitive rather than systematic, and we need to develop a more systematic knowledge of the code, whether we're at secondary or primary school. Now, you can teach spelling and these things, or in fact, you can even link it to poetry. How? Well, if we're teaching with syllabification, syllables are the beats in the words, aren't they? What defines poetry? The fact that it has a meter. And that meter is linked basically to the syllables and where the stresses form on the words. So, I have taught, for example, the Canterbury Tales, which is a very regular meter, but you can teach that to students who like hip-hop and rap, because that's all about rhythm. And so in order for them to access that, you talk about syllables. And then you talk about how to spell words and spell the syllables in each word. And students are actually learning to spell even though it's a poetry lesson. Creative people will be able to do more with that idea. But I just want you to point out that spelling is not, it can be taught discreetly, but it should be integrated as well so that students generalise. And when we teach spelling, it's really important that students review it regularly. So this idea of reviewing it regularly is important. The problem is, of course, that different students need to practice different words, don't they? The way that I've resolved this problem in the past, and I must confess I can't give you a research citation for this, but students have kept their own list and quizzed with a partner and keep a graph. And they have a cumulative list, so they just colour in another gradation on their bar graph when they've got the same word right 3 days in a row. And so students have a visible sign of their own progress and a list of words that they need to practice. And I don't know why that's done that. Well, I don't really need to talk about this because I've got 30 seconds left. But what I will say is that this was a threshold concept for me. I kept thinking that all I had to do was teach students. Acquisition is when you're learning to get something. I'm sitting in the car, trying to change gear, and it keeps making that horrible noise. Yeah? Accuracy is when I can do that, but it's all very slow and the drivers behind me are tooting their horns. Fluency is when I can do it and nobody really knows that I'm a new driver. Yeah? I used to teach my students here, so they all understood paragraphs and could produce one for me, and then we didn't practice it, so they didn't get fluency and they forgot. So fluency is basically the missing component in education, and there's a lovely quote here from a guy called Carl Viner, and it's really worth thinking about, and I would say that it agrees with me. A few minutes a day of time practice on carefully sequenced skills can eliminate what were previously considered irremediable learning problems. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.